This is Unit 1, Lecture 5. We're continuing to discuss branches of philosophy. This time we're going to talk about ethics. Ethics, the philosophy of morality, examines morally good and bad behavior, morally good and bad character, and bad and good moral judgment. Examples of fundamental ethical issues include the five controversies: hedonism versus non-hedonism, absolutism versus relativism, free will versus determinism, deontology versus teleology, and egoism versus utilitarianism. The hedonist argues that all acts that ultimately result in pleasure are morally good acts, and all acts that ultimately result in pain or suffering are morally bad acts. The word hedonism comes from the Greek word edon, meaning pleasure. An obvious objection to this theory is that it doesn't take into account one's duty. For example, when we think of the Apostle Paul doing his duty, we suspect that much of what he did was not because it produced pleasure, although perhaps he was looking to some greater pleasure in the life to come. Next up, absolutism versus relativism. The absolutist argues that there is one moral absolute, for example, God's will, from which all morality comes, or that there are several moral absolutes, for example, the evil of child abuse and the evil of gluttony, that cannot necessarily be reduced to one absolute, but are nevertheless absolutely wrong in and of themselves. The biggest objection to absolutism is that there's too much disagreement about values for any of them to be absolute. So, the relativist says, morality is relative, either to a place, we call this cultural relativism, or to a time, historical relativism. Objections include that we can't help but make judgments about other cultures or times. What Hitler did in Germany was wrong, even if it wasn't our culture. Slavery in America was wrong. Also, relativism ends up being self-contradictory because it states absolutely that there are no moral absolutes. Objectivism and subjectivism are similar to absolutism and relativism. The objectivist says that moral value is in the object being judged. The subjectivist says that moral value is in the mind of the judge. When I say, for example, slavery in America was morally wrong, if I'm an objectivist, I mean that something about slavery itself was wrong. The subjectivist, on the other hand, says that this is merely my judgment and is a statement of my disapproval. A primary objection to subjectivism is that if morality is subjective, then morality is merely a matter of taste. And if it's merely a matter of taste, then moral dispute is as silly as arguing about whether chocolate chip cookies taste good. Another famous debate in ethics, one that we'll encounter in Christian theology, is free will versus determinism. To believe in free will is to believe that there are acts we do that we could have done otherwise. So free will, by definition, is the ability to do otherwise. I pick up my coffee cup, and I don't think there was an antecedent cause other than my will to do it. Therefore, I acted out of free will, right? One objection is, how can I prove it? How can I prove that there wasn't an angel sitting on my shoulder, for example, whispering, "Pick up the cup"? Or how can I prove that I wasn't programmed from birth to pick up the cup? Just because I don't know of an external cause doesn't mean there isn't one. So along comes the determinist who says that every act is determined by something other than free will. Maybe it's God, maybe it's fate, maybe it's society, maybe it's biology. Maybe we're programmed from the very beginning, or maybe it's simply one series of causes after another. If the determinist is correct, then moral responsibility becomes meaningless. If I rob a bank, the determinist must say that I didn't do it freely. I had no other choice. I was determined to do it. Well, then don't blame me. But I should be held morally responsible. So let's assume the existence of free will for now. Another debate is between deontology and teleology, just over the question, what matters more, passing judgment on a moral act, the consequent of the act, or the motive behind the act? The deontologist says an act is morally good if and only if it's done from duty, regardless of the consequences. Among objections to deontology are, how do I know if something is my duty? And what happens if I have a conflict of duty? And there are many times I don't have time to consider my duty. Also, we can never be 100% sure of anyone's motive, including our own. So along comes teleology or consequentialism. The word teleology comes from the Greek word telos, meaning end, as in the end justifies the means. We don't see that word often in ethics, and it's often replaced with the word consequentialism. So what teleology says is that as long as the consequences are good, the act is good. One objection is that consequences don't tell the whole story. Suppose I killed somebody, God forbid, and that's all you know. Do you know enough to pass moral judgment? Would it make a moral difference if I did it out of self-defense or I did it to defend an innocent third party, as opposed to doing it accidentally or doing it out of malice? Also, the end doesn't always justify the means. Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky asks, suppose we could make everybody in the world happy by torturing and killing just one child. Would this be morally right? No. Sometimes the end is so awful that it won't justify any means. We also should ask, consequences for whom? Because one and the same consequence may be good for some and bad for others. This gets us to the next debate, egoism versus utilitarianism. The egoist says that the consequences that matter are the consequences for me. The psychological egoist says you can't help being an egoist. If you're a human being, you're an egoist. That doesn't mean you do bad things. In fact, the intelligent egoist will do everything they can to have friends and to avoid government persecution. But it will all be out of self-interest. One objection to this is obvious, the possibility of self-sacrifice. Jesus is Exhibit A. Clearly, people are capable of sacrificing their own interests. So I think on that point alone, the psychological egoist is wrong. So along comes the ethical egoist who says, I agree that self-sacrifice is possible, but it's wrong. If everybody looked out for their own interests first and didn't stick their nose into other people's business, says the rational egoist, the world would be a better place. So a new objection. Not only is self-sacrifice possible, but at times it can be morally good. If you can think of one morally good example of self-sacrifice, think Jesus again, then you've put the ethical egoists in their place. Now, mind you, I'm not saying we should never look out for our own interests. Of course, there are times when we should, but I don't think that's all ethics is. Hence, I think egoism is wrong. Utilitarianism agrees that the consequences matter, so utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. But it insists that we should seek the greatest good for the greatest number. This is a popular idea. It's probably the fundamental moral ideal of American culture. And there are two kinds of utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says an act is good if it promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. And rule utilitarianism says we should have rules in place that promote the greatest good for the greatest number. There are many objections to utilitarianism. For example, what is the greatest good? John Stuart Mill, perhaps the most famous utilitarian, said that it's pleasure and the absence of pain. Well, that gets us back to hedonism, which we've already challenged. And who gets to determine the greatest good? The people affected? An expert who knows better? Democracy says the people should decide for themselves. But what if the people don't know enough to make a wise decision? Also, does the greatest number mean simply the majority? Is it okay if 51% get what they want, but 49% have to suffer for it? That doesn't sound right. There's a danger of the tyranny of the majority. And think about Jesus in the parable of the lost sheep. That's hardly a utilitarian parable. Also, should we emphasize the greatest good or the greatest number if the different emphases call for different acts? For example, suppose a house is a greater good than a car, but with my $100,000, I can buy one person a little house, or I can buy 5 people cars. Should I go for the greatest good or the greatest number? Utilitarianism doesn't answer that decisively. This is the end of this brief lecture on ethics. Next, we discuss aesthetics.